Welcome, everybody. Professor Yusu Wang is currently a professor in the Hallerjoglu Data Science Institute at the University of California, San Diego. She is Associate Director for Research for the NSF-funded AI Institute, TILOS. Prior to joining UC San Diego, she was professor in the Computer Science and Engineering Department at The Ohio State University. She obtained her PhD degree from Duke University in 2004, where she received the Best PhD Dissertation Award at the Computer Science Department. Yusu primarily works in the fields of computational geometry and computational and applied topology. She is particularly interested in developing effective and theoretically justified algorithms for data analysis using geometric and topological ideas and methods, as well as applying them to practical domains, including computational neuroscience and material science. She's on the editorial board for the SCIEM Journal of Computing and the Journal of Computational Geometry. Currently, she's a member of the Computational Geometry Steering Community, and close to our heart, she's also a member of the AATRN Advisory Committee. So Yusu, thanks so much for giving our first talk today, and please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Henry, for the nice introduction, and really thanks everyone, Henry, Amir, and others for inviting me to give me this opportunity. So as Henry said, that my research is in geometric and topological data analysis, but what I'm going to talk about today is on graph neural networks. Well, I mean, the graph object, of course, I mean, it's very prevalent in many application domains, including in chemistry, molecular biology, and so on. Now, graph neural networks in the past decade also emerged as one of this very flexible and powerful frameworks to perform learning and optimization on graphs. Okay, and especially in the past few years, there's just so much tremendous developments about both on the theory, on the different architecture of graph neural networks, and also on the application in different domains. Okay, now while there are different type of neural network architecture developed for graphs, in general, theoretical understanding are still more limited. Okay. So what I'm thinking, because Henry told me that this is really kind of, this talk is like help to start a conversation. So I was thinking that what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to give a brief introduction to some of the graph neural network architecture, and also mention the limitations or the along the way of this architecture. Okay. So that was the plan. Now, as you can see here, for those of you who use GNNs, this is not inclusive. For example, I actually didn't mention the graph transformer, which in the past 2 years has been really popular, but I'll be happy to discuss about that later during the discussion time. Okay, all right. So that's a plan. So in other words, I mean, this is not so much about my own work, although I probably would mention a couple of them, but this is more like giving the audience an introduction of the architecture and the pros and the cons. Okay, and feel free to stop me anytime along the way. All right, so now one of the earliest type of graph neural network architecture is actually based on spectral methods, but I'm not going to mention that in this short talk. Instead, let me start with the message passing graph neural network, which is one of the most popular type architecture. Okay, so now when we use neural network essentially are just the composition of maps. Okay, and when we build a neural network architecture to handle data, now precisely what type of architecture we build would depend on the type of input, because if your input space is different, you probably need to handle it differently, to build it differently for your maps, for your function maps. Okay, so for example, we've all seen the so-called fully connected feed-forward neural network, this multi-layer perceptron here, when the input data is just a point in d-dimensional space. Okay, then we have a bunch of neurons take that as input, and then in the end the dimension can change, and in the end we output to a different dimension. Okay, and if the input is say images, we could have done the same. If I give you an image of size k by k, I could have treated this as a k-square dimensional vector and do a fully connected network. Or we can say that we should leverage the locality information in the image, because a pixel has its own neighbors, okay? And we should use that information. And then using this local receptive fields essentially give you this convolutional neural network, together, of course, with subsampling and so on, all right? Now, when we're given graph data, now if you think about it, the previous approaches do not immediately apply, because, I mean, for one thing, the graphs, they can be of a different size, okay? And what you're hoping is that you learn something on certain collection of graphs, and then you want to apply it to unseen graphs, which can be of a different size and different topology, looks very different, okay? So I don't have a fixed input, okay? Now, if you say, let's focus on the nodes of the graph, well, a node of a graph also don't have a fixed coordinate. There's no canonical coordinates of the nodes. We cannot say, let's input a d-dimensional vector for every node. And also, the neighborhood information, say graph neighbors, they are not usually, there's no, they're not of the same size. Graph, each node can have a different degree. And also, even when you're given the collection of neighbors, you don't have a canonical ordering of them. You want it to be permutation invariant to that ordering. Okay, so these are some of the challenges that involved when we try to design an architecture for graphs, to handling graphs. Now, message passing graph neural network is one way to address this. So the idea is that it's simple but kind of effective. So what we do is the following. Let's say that we start from a graph, okay? And at the beginning, every node, I'm going to put a d-dimensional, d0-dimensional vector. So every node has a feature representation, okay? Now, when we say now in this graph neural net, we move in layers. What you're really doing is that you're going to manipulate this node feature. So at the beginning, let's say a node associated with, say, two-dimensional feature, the degree and a constant, let's say. And then you manipulated this node feature, and at each step, every node would then update its node feature to make it better and better, more and more informative. Okay, we'll see in a minute and a half. Okay, and at every layer, you essentially, this function is really applied to the node feature, and all the nodes would then undergo some node feature transformation, and then you do that for L step. Okay, then you get a different node feature. You can think now, finally, what we're having here is that starting from some initial node feature, I now have a node embedding, because in the end, if this is a DL dimensional space, effectively you are embedding every node to a DL dimensional Euclidean space. It depends on the domain of your feature. Okay, if it's DL dimensional real values, then that's you have embedding to DL dimension. But many of the tasks, let's say you could have a bunch of molecules and you want to predict their potential reaction to, say, some drugs, then in that case, this is a graph level task. Namely, you want to, in the end, do a regression on the collection of this little, all these molecules and graphs. So then, very often, you could, from this node embedding, so here is still node-wise, from this node embedding, you do one more step. You say, let me take all these node features and then perform another function on top of that to get a fixed dimensional graph level representation. Once you have this, now your graph is represented by a fixed dimensional vector. You can use all the typical standard MLP and so on to further process that for regression task. Okay, so you can, so this is a high level structure, but what makes this one message passing, it's really, this is called graph level pooling. What makes this message passing is really, how am I going to every time update my node feature? Okay, so as we said, we need to figure out at each step, already every node has a feature vector. How am I going to update that? Okay, and in the message passing, general message passing framework, the way you update, okay, I mean, you don't have to read, let me explain this. The way you update is simply says that given a node, and I already have features from the previous layer. So right now, this node already has some feature. In the new layer, I'm going to take the node feature of myself and also all my neighbors. Okay, I take the node feature of all the neighbors, namely all the nodes connect to me via an edge, and there are a collection of them, and I treat them as a multi-set. because there's no order among them, so they have to be treated as a set. Okay, then I perform some function over there. The only thing that you want to be careful is that this function cannot be arbitrary function. Why? Because my neighbor do not have, the neighbor of a node V, the neighbors do not have canonical order. So you have to treat them, this multiset, in the permutation invariant manner. Namely, this function f needs to be permutation invariant to the second variable, this multiset. Okay, that sounds like, well, what shall we do? It turned out that there's actually a very simple way to achieve that. This is actually also include all the ways to model this kind of functions, which is that you actually now can decompose this function to be two functions. First, you can have any function to basically for every neighbor u of v, I first use a function f1 to combine the feature. You can think there's some sort of attention to combine the feature together. Okay, then I simply sum all this influence from all neighbors up. So the sum is important. The sum is what makes it permutation invariant, because once you do sum, it doesn't matter what order you give. Okay, once you have this feature coming from all my neighbors, I combine that with my own previous feature and then perform another function. So now in this form, both f0 and f1 they are arbitrary. They can be any functions. As such, you can just use standard, for example, MLP to model them, to learn them. So f0 and f1, this how you combine them. This is the learnable part. They have parameters. During your training process, you basically train the parameters there. Okay, and in the end, if the final application is a graph level application, then you also perform another from the node embedding, you perform another last step, this kind of pooling, which has to be permutation invariant to the permutation of the nodes order as well. Okay, so very often this is done by, say, sum and so on. So here's a very simple version. It's not a general, it's a simple version of the method passing. Basically, at every layer of your neural network, a node V is just the first aggregate features from its immediate neighbors. Okay, and then after aggregation, it then combines that aggregated feature together with myself and update it. For example, the aggregation can simply be I sum my neighbors, I average my neighbors' features, and then update could be that then I perform some transformation, say linear transformation followed by nonlinear activation to make the whole thing nonlinear. So that is in fact one of the most typical type of method passing neural network. Oh, actually I have it here. Okay, so this is a very simple form, very similar to the so-called GCN. Okay, all right. Now, here, another popular architecture, one of the, there are different method passing neural network proposed. It depends on how you initiate this aggregation, how you really model this aggregation function and how you model the update function. Okay, this is one example, very similar to the so-called GCN. And here's another one, the so-called graph isomorphism network, which even though it has a simple form, it is known that this is as expressive as any method passing neural network in terms of discriminating graphs. I'll get to this a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so here this is the aggregation you can think, and this is the update using performing a multi-layer perception on top of that. Okay, all right. Now, we note that this message passing GN really is just that I'm keep aggregating my neighbors' information and then in each iteration. Okay, so it's very similar to kind of a local algorithm. Okay, and it turned out that this type of aggregation also gives it limitation in its representation power. Okay, and to understand this limitation more formally, let me introduce the so-called WL test. It's a graph isomorphism test. Basically, it's a very simple test. If you give me two graphs, you ask me, are they isomorphic? Namely, are they the same under permutation of the nodes? Now, this test, the so-called Weisfeiler-Lehman test, will tell you either they are not isomorphic or maybe they're isomorphic. I cannot really tell. Okay, so it cannot resolve the graph isomorphism problem because this algorithm, this procedure is actually very efficient. It's a linear time. While we know in general, the graph isomorphism test right now, the best is pseudo polynomial time. So how does this WL test work? It's also a very simple idea. It's said that it's essentially based on the coloring of graph nodes. As I suppose at the beginning, all the graph nodes start with some initial feature. They call it color. Ignore the hash. It's just so let's say at the beginning, everyone is associated with degree. Okay. Now the way we represent the graph at the beginning is the histogram. You can think the multiset, the histogram of this initial feature. So at this point, for example, G is just represented by all the initial feature as a multiset, and the H is. Now, can I look at this two histogram? I said, well, I cannot tell. They have the same feature distribution. So then we move to step one. In step one, every node will update its own color to be the multiset of color of its neighbors together with itself. In other words, for example, 3, the color in next step becomes 3, and my neighbor is 1, 2, 1. While for this node with degree 3, now its new color is 3, and my node's neighbor is 1, 2, 2. So now we see these two get differentiated. Okay, now when you look at the whole collection of node features, the G and H don't have the same histogram of feature anymore. Okay, so we say these two graphs are not isomorphic. If we still fail, I repeat. Every time I update my feature using my neighbor's feature set, and then repeat. Okay, so this process, if you think about it, really for a single graph, I'm simply having a hierarchy, and every step I aggregate my neighbor's feature and collect that into a multi-set. Okay, so from this point of view, it's not surprising that there's a very clear parallel between this WL test and the graph method passing graph neural network, because here I'm just collecting my neighbor's features multi-set. In graph neural network, I just take my neighbor's feature and then aggregate by a function. That's it. Okay, so one's kind of sets, one is now have a function form. Okay, and as a result, it's not surprising that it turned out from the ability by distinguishing graph, I mean that from the ability of separating graphs. Okay, so GNN, which is one special form of message passing GNN I just mentioned, is as powerful as the WL test. In other words, if two graphs cannot be separated by WL test, no GNN with initial feature, weak initial feature, you cannot make a very strong initial node feature, no GNN, no matter what parameter you put there, none of them can tell these two graphs apart. The output will always be the same. Okay, and if they can, then there exists the graph GNN that can tell them apart. So now, and part of the reason of this is really coming from that. If you think about the what is going on in the message passing graph neural network, since you are collecting your neighbor's information and aggregate them in some way, if it happens that the graph, for example, in this case, you have initial node feature, in this case ABC. Now, these two graphs are clearly different, but if you think about the expansion of the neighbor's node feature, the tree that you obtain are the same for this node and this node. That's why that even when you aggregate their information, no matter what function you put on top of them, you always get the same output. So you cannot tell the node A and in this graph G1 from the node A in the graph G2. Okay, because if you just look at the sequence, because once you do the message passing, you don't have node ID. You don't know which feature. Once I aggregate information, I don't know which neighbor it's coming from. What neighbor's neighbor this come from? So that information is lost. Very much in computer science, have this local algorithm. Okay, so this is the reason that gives this limitation. And in fact, summarized by this very nice survey paper by Stephanie Jagielka. The standard message passing neural network without actual augmentation, okay, cannot decide, for example, shorten the cycle in the graph, total number of cycles, diameter, existence of cliques and other subgraphs and so on. It cannot differentiate all deregular graph. This is just some examples. Okay. All right. Now, of course, then the question is that what can we do to make this more powerful? Okay. Now, one simple thing to do is that, as I said, what I said earlier is that we start with every node start with some initial color, initial feature. Okay. Earlier, when I say it has this limitation, it's really assuming the initial feature is only the information you can get from a node and its immediate neighbors. Okay, because if you make the initial feature super strong, if you say initial feature encode the whole graph isomorphism type of this graph, then you need exponential space to store that. Of course, now it becomes very powerful. Okay, so we're talking about just constant feature and so on. So one possibility is that you can augment this initial node feature to add this extra information that you cannot encode. Okay, so for example, we have done using persistent diagram-based feature at the nodes, or use that as edge attention and to augment, enhance the power of graph neural network. Now in the GNN community, in recent years, this position encoding, you can think of that as a way to enhance the power of node feature as well. So in particular, in position encoding using, say, Laplace eigenfunction. However, I do want to mention one thing here is that using the spectral structure using Laplace eigenfunctions as a way to do node embedding, kind of get the initial position to find the coordinate of nodes is very useful and have been shown to be helpful in practice. However, there's the issue of that in general, they might eigenfunctions, especially that when the eigenvalue has multiplicity, eigenfunction is not a collection of eigenvectors and not unique. Okay, because you can take any also normal vectors in the eigenspace to be the eigenvectors. So you have this issue that in fact you want to make this eigenvector to be a basis invariant, and there's some recent work try to do that as well. Although in practice, I think people typically don't do that. Okay. Now, you can also try to add other more global information like attention. And in the last 2 years, there have been a range of different graph transformer type of architecture that augment the graph with a global edge information, also using attention to select which are important. That has been shown to be helpful. Another way to make this more powerful is to use some higher order GNNs. Okay, and now let me go quickly over here because just to give the idea, the WL test I just described is an update of information at the nodes. So you're putting, say, colors at the nodes, and then you keep update the information at the graph nodes, and then you look at the histogram of that features as a way to represent the graph. Okay, if you instead of look at individual nodes, if you say let's look at a pair of nodes, triples of nodes, quadruples of nodes. In other words, now if you define this procedure for k tuples of graph nodes, then clearly now you're taking a higher order information. If you just spend 1 minute to think about it, you will be able to tell, for example, between 3 nodes that form a wedge or 3 nodes that form a triangle. Okay, so this gives you a more information. And you can do very similar type of update every time from this k-tuple. You consider all the neighboring k-tuples and then use their information to update your information and repeat. Okay, so it's the same procedure as the WL test, but now you perform it on k-tuples. One of the questions is how you define the neighbor set of a k-tuple, and there are different ways to define that. This is a standard KWL test, more natural extension of what I just said. Here, there's a different way. Now, this different way actually turned out that it's closely, these 2 ways are closely related, and this different way called folklore KWL test is easier to be re-implemented into a neural network architecture. Okay. Now, as you are increasing this k, you're using k-tuple information. It is known that other than 1k equal to 1 or 2, when you increase k, your discriminative power in terms of separating graph strictly increase. Okay, in other words, it is helpful as you increase k. That's why And as I said, this is a folklore version of WL test inspire neural network architecture that can do message passing on K tuples. Okay, this which is strictly more powerful than 1WL message passing we just talked about for K bigger than 2. Okay, the downside is that when you consider K tuples, now you have to handle all the possible K tuples. The size grows with n to the K at least. Okay, so it becomes very expensive to both to maintain the information to do training. Okay, now one might ask, why do I consider all K tuples? Maybe that's not necessary. Maybe we only consider some special subsets of K tuples. Okay, so to this end, starting from a graph, you can also think I'm going to put certain cells into the graph, and only those cells would give me my higher order tuples. Okay, one such version is the so-called simplicial neural networks. Okay, method passing for that. So like if I give you a graph, imagine that now given this graph, I'm just going to, whenever 3 edges are in, I put a triangle in. Whenever 6 edges between 4 nodes are in, namely I have a 4 click, I put a tetrahedron inside. Okay, so I don't take arbitrary triples. I only take those that already forming some shape. Okay, so what I just said is called a click complex. And now I do message passing on the simplices of this click complex. Okay, so you can still do message passing, and you can extend this to say, why limit ourselves to simplices? How about cell complex? This actually seems to be beneficial in terms of the molecular application. So for example, if I have the following in the bound graph of my molecule, okay, so now in message passing, it's hard to see the cycle information, okay, but what you could do is that if you have a way to compute the cycles, you say that, let me put this as a 2 cell, here is another 2 cell, okay, now I have a cell complex, I do message passing over the cell complex. Now you kind of can aggregate information among all the atoms along this little, say, Benz ring and so on. Okay, so this becomes more powerful. So this is an extension of the simplicial one called the cellular network, and it can process the. It seems to be, at least empirically, in the original paper, seems to be beneficial to the molecular application. Oops, this is just saying that.
So Yusu, yes. If you could wrap up in 1 minute or so.
I will, yes, okay. Let me just point out that there's one last architecture, which is treating graph as tensors, okay? And let me ignore this. The key point is that how you implement the operation, which has to be permutation equivariant, okay? So it turned out that even though this sounds like a very hard task, but it can be done. And there's a different family of neural network architecture called the IGN, invariant graph neural networks. Again, it can have different orders, okay? So now I mentioned earlier that essentially, this is just to summarize from separating power, the power of the neural network increased as K increased, but that also become more expensive to do, okay? You can actually rewrite all of this into universal approximation of the message passing neural network in terms of approximating functions defined on space of graphs, okay? So as K increase, this approximation power increase, okay? So here I was just mentioning one of our recent work, when we treat graphs as a Markov chain metric spaces, you can actually have another view to look at this, which give you a distance for graphs that can both be used to argue property of a message passing neural networks. This distance itself can also be used to compare, say, reconstruction laws of between graphs in a generative model and so on. Okay, this is embodied by WL test as well. Now, there are also other range of issues. I mean, some of you might have heard of over smoothing issue of a graph neural network, or over squashing. There's a kind of orthogonal issues, which in general make it a little harder to capture long-range interaction using message passing framework. But of course, you can say, why don't we use a hierarchical version and try to make this become coarser and coarser to like a CNN, try to capture long-range information. Now, there are different challenges involved. People are doing that. However, some of the challenges included that this hierarchical pooling, there's no canonical way. And also, if you still have node embedding paths, you then have to come back from the coarse representation, you have to come back to the full representation. One can do that using some architecture, but these are usually challenges over there. In the last 2 years, graph transformer type of architecture has become very popular. Empirically, has not been completely demonstrated that the graph transformer really outperform the other architectures. Part of the reason is because a lot of the benchmark data sets is small. So recently, I think in this year's coming NeuralRips, there's a paper saying that you can actually, they provide the benchmark data for capturing language interaction, where they show the transformer type approach benefits. But transformer has a downside, has a challenge, which is that it's usually take fully connected graphs, and how to properly specify this connection, yet still make sure that we capture all the long range interaction. That's, I think, remains a challenge. And thanks. Sorry for.
Thanks so much, Yusu. So we have time for maybe one question. Questions from folks? Yusu, I'll jump in. Oh, Sapna, please go. No, let me start with Joshua, if that's okay. Joshua, please go ahead.
Oh, sure. Thanks for the talk. So I'm a material scientist as well. And like you said, graph neural networks are becoming very important in this field, but also understanding how they're functioning is very important. So could you talk a little bit about what types of things people look at with graph neural networks to understand how they're modeling your system?
When you say, sorry, can you be a little bit more precise? What do you mean?
I don't know. I guess it is kind of a broad question, because so like if you are using graph neural network for a molecule, for example, and you're trying to understand some physical property of that molecule, how can you go about doing that by examining various parts of your graph neural network?
So, I don't know whether the following would be what you have in mind. So in general, depends on the task. From a GNN aspect, you can think that popularly we have either node level tasks. Okay, let's say that in a road network, I'm sorry, I'm not using a physical system as example. You could try to predict, based on the information, you try to predict the congestion, then that become a node level application. So you could have a bunch of training data, depends on the time, that could be time sequence data, and then you combine it with a graph topology, you train a system that then later you give me a different road network and potentially some different extra information. I can predict that how the congestion pattern would evolve. That's become a node level task, namely at every node, I either predict a vector or I predict, say, a time series function. Okay, you could also have graph level application. Let's say that you have these molecules and you try to see who could react to a certain drug. I'm making it up. Now, again, each molecule can be modeled as the bound graph, or maybe augmented the bound graph with extra information. Now, the training set would be that their reaction to certain property. This is every graph, every molecule would have certain properties as a function. Then you basically, essentially, after training, you give me new molecules, then I can spit out its property using that model. So these are the two most prominent type of use of GNN. But you can also say that there are, many other ways, including generative models, for example, to help you to generate a different real molecule-like structure, or to use it to using it to help to I think to do for example having courses representations in the latent space to perform, for example, to replace simulations, certain simulation step, because when I have a coarse representation in the latent space, maybe that's easier to carry out the prediction of the how the conformation may change. Yeah, I hope this answers your question. Yeah.
So let's postpone the further questions until the discussion, and I'll pass it over to Sapna to introduce our next talk.